From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We're joined, as always, with our super producer, Alexis, codenamed Doc Holiday Jackson. Most importantly, you are here, and that makes this the stuff they don't want you to know. It is the top of the week, which means it's time for more strange news. And, you know, I've been thinking, at some point, we're going to start experimenting with this format. Matt, a while back, you and I just started listing headlines that didn't make it onto the show at the very end, and peek behind the curtain. You know, while we're getting rolling and preparing for strange news, we go through a lot of stuff and we discuss, you know, like, cool stories. Is this newsworthy? How do we try to find some variety? Today, we've got what may be a case of sabotage, what may be the financial future of a nation state, and then we've got Mars. That's true. A guy got swallowed by a whale this week, and we're also talking about Mars. It's pretty eventful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We kind of had to like do a little like, hey, which one should we go with? And I think we ended up with a pretty good crop, fellas. Speaking of crop, should we start with the fruit story?
Oh yes,
sure.
Yes.
Okay, why not?
Fruit in space.
Yeah. So the New York Times recently reported about a week ago that they published an article claiming that watermelons had been found on Mars, like fields and fields of watermelons. Here's the quote from the article by Joe Schmo, SCHMOE, saying fields of watermelons found on Mars, police say. Okay. Authorities say rise of fruit aliens is to blame for glut of outer space watermelons. And then it concludes with the line saying, the FBI declined to comment on reports of watermelons raining down, but confirmed that kiwis have been intercepted. The story is terribly boring. Watermelon tastes good, police say.
What the hell is happening? No, I feel like I'm tripping right now.
Yeah, it's a weird one, guys. So essentially what happened is the New York Times, like, I guess it must have been a test or some kind of like lorem ipsum, you know, the lazy brown dog jumps over the picket fence kind of thing to test layout, right?
Right.
Like, because there's actually an archived version of it that I found on, what's it called here? It is called, yeah, it's literally just called like archive.is. And it's like laid out with, you know, measurements on each side, like you would, you know, see maybe a template for a web page or, you know, a print publication. And the New York Times very quickly withdrew the article, which is why it now, you know, has to live on an archive page, and printed some form of retraction. I've got to find that retraction here real quick. There's quite a few articles about it. And the most substantial article I was able to find that I didn't have to pay or register for was on the Indian Express. The rise of fruit aliens. New York Times retracts article claiming watermelons were found on Mars. Netizens react with memes, of course. So I guess the thing that's interesting about this, you guys, is that we've been seeing a lot of interesting space news lately, like that very much pertains to things that maybe once were completely unbelievable, but now are possibly more entering the realm of believability, like a lot of this disclosure stuff, a lot of these declassified videos that we've seen through the To the Stars Academy and all of that. So I could see how initially a headline like this would be like, yeah, okay, maybe we missed this. Because when I first heard it, I I was on board for a second. I was like, what? Cool. Are they underground or something? Like, how come we haven't seen these before? But yeah, apparently what happened was, according to a spokesperson for the New York Times, this is what they said. I'll just give them the quote. Earlier today, a mock article intended for a testing system was published on our site in error. The article has since been removed. Of course, it has been, archived in multiple places, and Google cached it. So the memes abounded. There's now a link to another page that reads, "This article was published in error." It's kind of, egg on the face, I would say, of the New York Times, who have certainly had a rough go of it over the past administration, just constantly being, maligned in the fake news New York Times or the failing New York Times or whatever. So probably not the best PR move for them, but it's pretty funny. And of course, there's a lot, when this initially came out, there were a lot of conspiracy theory discussions taking place on Twitter. Watermelon and Mars began to trend all over Twitter and other social media platforms. And there were, tweets like, question, what if the NYT watermelon story is their pre-write of the forthcoming UFO report? Because I think you guys know, oftentimes big journalistic organizations like that will pre-write obituaries for celebrities, say, for example, that are like, maybe getting a little long in the tooth, and they might also cache or pre-write something based on a source that they have, or who knows. Let's see if there were a couple other ones. We've got one saying, going to assume that the agents of the watermelons on Mars got in touch and let them know they weren't dead yet. Let's see. We've got, if anything, I thought it'd be muskmelons.
Nice.
You know why that's fun? It's so funny. I'd never heard of a muskmelon. And the other day I was at this very popular international grocery store here in Atlanta called Beaufort Highway Farmers Market. And I saw a big carton of muskmelon juice. And in seeing it in print, I realized that if you remove the M from melon and flip it around, you've got yourself Elon Musk right there.
Whoa.
I don't know if that's a...
Wow, that's a thing.
It's a thing that exists. We've got watermelon taste so good, police say. Looks like the NYT need the weekend as badly as me. Then we've got, is it bad? I wanted to read that story. No, it's not. The Mars rover can have one space watermelon as a treat. Just a treat. That's from Drew Alvarez. And then finally, we've got one from John Christian saying, what's happening in the New York Times. The National Farmers Union even chimed in with, we aren't aware of any space watermelons, but we'll double check. So that, it's a goofy story, but it's a good example of what happens when our super instant gratification news, sources get something mega wrong in the most elaborately hilarious way possible. So, I don't know.
Well, okay, for a couple things. The Perseverance mission that's happening right now on Mars with the rover, I think that has a lot to do with this seeming maybe plausible in that first moment, even as strangely written as the article was. Because you guys remember not long ago, there were some images released from the Perseverance mission that were mistaken for fungus by a lot of online reporting. And, it made the rounds like crazy. So then, I can imagine that this silly article, even as a test article, was maybe written in jest for just like as an inside joke for some people. Right. And then it gets published. So that's one thing. I imagine that's why the lay person reader may mistake it for being real. The second thing is that it just reminds me how important every little thing is that gets published by an outlet like the New York Times or the Washington Post or the BBC or, the Guardian, anyone. Any small thing that gets published there is taken as fact.
Sure.
And rightly should be, because that's what those institutions are meant to do. It just, I don't know that I think this snafu kind of speaks directly to that.
I'll tell you, man, the one thing that I think a lot of reporting about this story is ignoring is the work ethic of whomever is going by the moniker Joe Schmo, because they could have just Lorem Ipsum'd the whole thing, but instead They created this narrative with fruit aliens. It's pretty compelling stuff. And I was thinking the same thing you were, Matt. This is not occurring in a vacuum. Obviously, people are primed for news about Mars. And this reminds me too, a long time ago, earlier in the show, we talked about one of the problems with searching for life on other planets, which goes down to the methodology of the instruments used to detect stuff. Like they vaporize things as a way of testing for life. And so a lot of people, especially in the more conspiratorial forums, are already certain that there has been something discovered, that's why there's so much international attention on sending something to Mars. So if you're already primed that way, and you already know there have been so many like false starts or misreporting of mundane events, then you would think logically that there is going to be some weird stuff found on Mars. Now, why Joe decided to pick watermelons, we're not going to know unless that person comes forward. But look, editors of New York Times, shareholders, board members, what have you, decision makers, find out who this is and give them a raise because they are awesome.
Yes,
they are, but also the thing kind of falls apart a little bit. It's like they kind of gave up around the end, where it's just sort of like police say watermelon tastes good. It's like they started in with like, a pretty snappy piece of like onion worthy sort of joke journalism, and then sort of lost steam there near the end a little bit. But
my bet is that it was done in minutes, a few minutes.
Sure. Absolutely.
That whole thing was just
blasted out.
Somebody clacked away.
100%. And I agree with you, Ben. It does speak to the the work ethic and the quality of the talent at the New York Times. If you're just going to bash off what's ultimately a pretty funny little joke as literally a test, when you could have just copied and pasted some garbage nonsense text in there. But there was some other good, I'd highly recommend folks, look for themselves at the memery around this. But there was a few saying, talking about kind of historical New York Times things they do, or saying, oh, I was bummed that it wasn't a full length article with like interactive visuals. A lot of times New York Times have like interactive infographics and things like that. Let's see. There was one more really fun one. Oh, of course, there was a Charlie Day gif saying giving rise to the Martian watermelon truthers. There's a nice War of the Worlds kind of meme where it's like the three-legged kind of like snaky walker things, only it's a giant watermelon at the top. And then, yep, here's the one from Tony Hotran. Honestly, a bit disappointed it's not a 10,000 word feature complete with interactive visuals. That would have been taking the test to the next level, fellas.
There you go. Ben, I can't get this image out of my head of Perseverance and I think it was Opportunity and all these other rovers on Mars where, like you said, they vaporize material to test for life. I'm imagining, an extraterrestrial species that is like 7-to-1 scale for humans, or like huge compared to humans. And they build a machine that is, in their scale. And then it somehow makes its way to Earth. It's unmanned or aliened, however you want to put that. And then it just scoops up some soil in a part of a house and just vaporizes it to test it. And you're like, oh, there was some organic material in there. All right. Well,
well, that's one of the big concerns, right? Because you can have a pretty good idea of what you might encounter, right? And you can have a wish list of stuff you would want to encounter, but it's important to note that the scientists who are conducting this research are very cautious about getting anybody's hopes up or being misquoted, because they know they'll inevitably be misquoted. In their mind, the best thing to do is to not necessarily look for life, but to look for components that would be indicative of a past possibility of life or maybe a future possibility of life. And once you get past that point, they may feel like they're getting a little too science fiction-y. But I did want to add on one last note for anybody who's disappointed that there are actually no watermelons on Mars. If you want space fruit, you can try it here on Earth. Space fruit is the name of the fruit-centric Dippin' Dots series available at a tourist trap. Can I say tourist trap? At a tourist venue near you. So it's not quite Mars, but you can get a taste of space fruit.
That's amazing. I want that.
I wonder what it tastes like. Like cosmic, I don't know, cosmic dust, perhaps. It seems like it would be dangerous. I wouldn't want to eat something that was grown on an alien planet in completely unknown, conditions, right? Seems like it could kill you dead. Also, watermelons? Like, you'd think there would be like some other like indigenous fruit to Mars, unless maybe previous expeditions had planted seeds that had only just now started to sprout because of the way time moves in space. Just a theory. But I don't know, guys. Anything else? I think we could probably move on.
Just a shout out to one of I think he's the user interface developer or one of the user interface developers there at NASA. His name is Parker Abercrombie. Wow, what a name.
Mm-hmm. It's a great name.
Just shout out to you, Parker.
All his clothes are monogrammed. You can just tell.
Or he also can just wear Abercrombie and Fitch clothes and it'll, look like it's monogrammed or
Good
like
point.
everything's got his name on it. All right, we're going to take a quick break for a sponsor and then be back with more strange news.
And we have returned. Before I take us to Central America, where our second story takes place, I would like to make a public service announcement for all our fellow conspiracy realists who are not yet aware of this. Leonard Nimoy is known as an actor, right? Famously playing Spock on the Star Trek franchise. But he is also a musician. He doesn't get enough credit. And I know there's a question on a lot of people's minds right now. What is the album Two Sides of Leonard Nimoy about? Well, let's dispel the myths right here. It's not necessarily about him being Spock, but it is a continuation of his earlier album, Spock and Space, which is his debut album. Okay, so now I think we've cleared that up. Right? Everybody could breathe a little bit easier. Tensions were running high.
I was
concerned.
discussing
this.
In the middle of the earth, in the land of the Shire.
It's been a weird weekend. Yes. To this
you can't stop it, Bilbo Baggins.
Yes.
King of the Wild Frontier. No,
it's close, though. It is close sonically. So do check that out. It does verge into levels of Shatner-esque Rocket Man greatness. But while you are checking that out, and while you are feverishly downloading the album on your platform of choice, journey with us to something completely unrelated, as far as I know, which is El Salvador. So previously, we reported on some pretty horrific things in El Salvador. And I realized that this country, being a relatively small place, doesn't get a lot of news coverage. So I didn't want to leave us all with this skewed negative view of El Salvador, especially for anybody who's never been there. So I'd like to explore this one. El Salvador may be one of the vanguards, one of the heralds of a new age in currency. As we record, El Salvador is set to become the world's first nation to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. This could be big. This could be weird. But initially, just off that headline, what do you guys think? What are your thoughts?
I mean,
good for holders of Bitcoin.
Well, yeah,
sort of. I mean, it's so weird, the whole scene with the crypto thing. Like a word from Elon Musk can like tank it in a day. It's a little bit sketchy. And news like this, but what's the deal with the government of El Salvador? Isn't it considered somewhat corrupt? Or isn't that an issue?
Well, yes, that is correct. Depending on, especially if you listen to the political opponents. But then the more cynical of us in the audience could easily argue that every government is to a degree corrupt. Even the really, really squeaky clean ones like Singapore. But in this case...
Is that a joke?
What?
Was that a joke?
Well, yeah. Well, no, kind of. It depends on what kind of corruption we're talking about. Are you talking about a country where it's like accepted to bribe police? That's a standard operating procedure. Or are we talking about a country like the U.S., where private contractors make billions of dollars a year based entirely on nepotism and their relationship with politicians?
It's totally,
Corp.
No, it's totally a good point, Ben. I mean, there's corruption comes in many shapes and flavors. And I guess when I think of the types of corruption that exists in maybe some South American countries like that, I think it's a little more off the books, greasing palms, people trying to enrich themselves by making backroom deals. But then you're right. When I say that out loud, how is that any different than just the more official version of it that happens here in the United States? It's really not. So point taken, Ben. Point taken.
Well, may I just jump back to you? You asked that question earlier, Ben, and I'm sorry, I've been thinking about it. Like, what do we actually think about all of this? My initial thought was, how do you get enough El Salvadorians, or like just the citizens of El Salvador, to adopt Bitcoin to make this, I don't know, worthy of a major announcement, worthy of a major push to incorporate Bitcoin along with, US dollars as their legal tender? Like, how do you do that? And it seems as though what you're going to tell us here is that there's a partnership of some kind that's happening beyond just announcing that, hey, we're going to accept Bitcoin now as legal tender.
Yeah, that's a good question. And you're spot on. The US dollar is legal tender in El Salvador. And for people who are supporting this plan, a huge factor in their logic is the commission fees on remittances abroad. So if someone is sending money from a different country to El Salvador, just wiring it down, then those commissions on just moving the money around can cover like 20% of the principal cost. So with a decentralized currency, the idea would be for the average person that you can maybe cut down on some of those fees. And then, like you said, Noel, for the people who are more like altcoin enthusiasts, they're very interested in the technological aspects of it. This is a great science experiment. Now, will it work out? Goes back to how you feel about the government, because yes, El Salvador has had a lot of criticism for the current administration. And then also, this is completely new territory. It's kind of surprising that El Salvador would be the first country to step into the future here. And the question is, are they going to be in an advantageous position, or are they going to be more like guinea pigs at this point?
I guess what I was getting at, though, is some of the criticism behind adoption of Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies in general is that it's so easy to use for like money laundering. It's so easy to use for illegal activities. And that's, I think, what I was asking. And I'm sorry if it's a silly question, but I just wonder is that the impetus behind this? If there is corruption in the government, to accept it as legal tender to muddy the waters of currency so that it'll be easier to perpetrate these types of frauds and felonies?
Yeah, I mean, that's valid for sure. There is a big piece of this conversation that we have to give some air to, which is El Salvador, like many other poorer countries, has at times run into tensions with the world's monetary system as it stands now, most particularly the IMF, International Monetary Fund. And Bitcoin could be seen as a way to escape the policies of the IMF because they're using a different currency. Just a few days before we recorded this, I believe over the weekend, the Bitcoin community itself spoke out, and they may be planning to loan El Salvador $1 billion worth of Bitcoin to help them fully adopt this as a legal tender. And they did this in response to the IMF, who said, we've got some concerns. This will be a banking nightmare. So what we may see happening is a confrontation in Central America between the old financial guard, the Black Monday murders types, and then the new, a tech literati. Techorati? There's a word like that. Yeah. And I'm really interested to see how this works out. And I would be astonished if world leaders and economists are not also paying attention, because one of the ways that you enforce sovereignty and hegemony is through having people use your money. That's why the U.S. is so into being a reserve currency, and that's why France instigated the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, because they wanted to control the African franc, or keep control of it.
No, this is really interesting to me, Ben. This is the first time I'm hearing about this. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. I had no idea that El Salvador they are working with this company Strike, or an app called Strike through a different company. But when they introduced this and launched mobile payments in El Salvador, like specifically, according to CNBC, Strike became the most downloaded app in the country.
Yes.
So there's definitely an appetite for it within amongst the citizens. And did you mention the 70% number?
We did not. Lay it on us.
According to CNBC, 70% roughly of El Salvadorian citizens do not have bank accounts, and they operate in cash-only transactions. I can totally imagine that having a Bitcoin account on your phone could, in a lot of ways, seem more secure. And if you could, just perform daily transactions through your phone with your Bitcoin, then I can imagine that being a big deal, and people would actually enjoy it.
Yeah, because you wouldn't have to go through some of the hassles that you encounter with physical currency, right? So if you are getting money wired in and you live in El Salvador, then as we said, then you might get hit with a ton of fees, like 10% or more. These transfers can take days to arrive, and then sometimes you have to go there in person to physically pick up the cash. And just to set the stage a little bit further with statistics, one really important part of the conversation here is just how much of El Salvador's GDP is remittances. So people travel to other countries, they work, they send money back to their families and their loved ones. That alone is 20% of El Salvador's gross domestic product.
Wow. Fascinating. There's a couple of other interesting little side stories connected to this. Like, for one, since 2019, this one particular area in El Salvador called El Zante has been using Bitcoin as legal tender. It's referred to Bitcoin Beach, and it was a program that was going to kind of like almost pilot the idea of using Bitcoin as legal tender. They referred to it as a mission to build a, quote, a sustainable Bitcoin economic ecosystem on the coast of El Salvador. There's more than 50 different vendors that accept it there, everything from hotels to restaurants to surf instructor camps to, fruit stands, hardware stores, anything you can think of pretty much. And I think my favorite little side story is the current president of El Salvador, who's only 39 years old. His name is, forgive me for butchering his pronunciation, Nayib Bukele, I believe. He is kind of behind this, and he has done this thing where he is creating this idea of mining sustainably and cheaply, mining Bitcoin. As we know, it uses lots of electricity and causes lots of controversy in terms of the sustainability of it and the effects on the environment. He wants to use geothermal energy generated from volcanoes in El Salvador to create 100% clean, this was his words, not mine, 100% renewable, zero emissions energy to mine Bitcoin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is, it's an interesting idea, but we'll see how close it comes to being reality. There's something else that has a lot of people worried, and I'd love to hear what the Bitcoin enthusiasts in the crowd today think about this. What happens when Bitcoin reaches its limit? So when we talk about cryptocurrencies, and Bitcoin is, the gold standard, by which I mean it's the coin that most people are going to be most familiar with. We're also talking about possibilities for risk. Like the US dollar has predictability because it's a reserve currency, because everybody around the world decided to agree with little or no backing that those coupons counted for specific values. What happens if Bitcoin skyrockets in value? What happens if it plummets in value? What will, the average person in El Salvador do? How will it affect them? Those are really serious questions that I think bear some research. This is definitely jumping into the deep water without putting your toe in first, aside from the village mentioned earlier.
Well, and we know it does do that thing, Ben. Like, it does. It can skyrocket. Everyone gets really excited, and it can absolutely plummet with just like a word from, say, Elon Musk on Saturday Night Live. And the confidence in it is a lot harder to measure, I would say, than maybe the stock market. But it's a fascinating development, I would say, and very meaningful, and I think potentially a political sort of middle finger to the United States.
Well, that could be seen as part of it, but it's definitely, I would say, if it's a middle finger to someone, it's less the U.S. because the U.S. dollar will still be used and accepted. It's more a middle finger to those international banking institutions, which are themselves, enormously controversial. You'll hear critics, for instance, say that the IMF is an instrument of resource extraction or an instrument of financial enslavement. Again, those are not our statements. Those are from the opponents of these outfits. So to the opponents of these institutions, the argument is something like they're putting entire countries in debt bondage, and then they're using that as a tool of leverage to influence the policies that get written, the direction of the government, and perhaps most importantly, how the government interacts with international private corporations. That's where you get into deep water. So maybe El Salvador is able to break what some see as global financial chains, but then also El Salvador may be putting itself in a profound risk for instability. That's where the story stands now, and you'll have a lot of people on either side of the argument, but we would like to hear from you if you've been to El Salvador, if you've traveled around Central America, if you live in El Salvador. What are people saying about this on the ground? Do people believe that this is a conspiracy of sorts? I'm sure they do. I'd just love to hear some firsthand reporting of it. So hit us up, as always, 1-833-STDWYTK, conspiracy at iHeartRadio.com. We're going to pause for a word from our sponsors. We'll be back with one more piece of strange news.
Okay, and we're back. I am not smart enough to fully understand this, but I'm trying to imagine how you walk into a convenience store with your Bitcoin app and you pay 2/600ths for a Coke and a bag of chips or something.
It's all like based on exchange rates, the way it would be in any kind of other currency swap situation, I would imagine. Like if you're going on exchanges, you can exchange one type of coin for another. So like there are these literally, just exchanges where you put in $1.50 and then it converts to Bitcoin, and that's like, 0.0000001 Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So it's just all these little calculations. You absolutely can do it on PayPal. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, have you ever seen in gas stations even, they've got these Bitcoin ATMs. Apparently the fees on those are exorbitant. I really don't understand the functionality of them. I've never seen anyone use them. But it's an interesting thing for sure.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm going to look more into it because right now I'm just confused.
Oh, Matt, can I set you up this story?
Yeah.
I'm super into this. Okay, so for some reason I was on a Breaking Bad rabbit hole. I get into rabbit holes all the time. This one happened to be Breaking Bad because it's an amazing story with phenomenal writing and acting. And I was watching the train episode. If you've seen Breaking Bad, you know the one I'm talking about. You remember that?
Yeah, I remember.
No, give me one more detail.
It's a heist.
Yes, of course. With the liquid, the stuff. They're trying to get the precursor.
Yeah.
Whatever, right.
Yeah. This is.
And then the little kid on the bike.
Oh, yeah.
That's a crusher,
Isn't that part of the train?
Maybe
yes,
it
it
is.
is.
No,
that's at the,
it's
that's
a big
at the
part.
very end of the episode.
And Todd, the guy who looks kind of like the Matt Damon, it shows the dark side of his character. But anyway, I was really excited to learn about this story you chose, Matt, because I'm on a train kick right now.
There you go.
But what's going on? Is there something crooked afoot?
Well, it's yes, there's something crooked rail. So this story comes to us from December of last year, December 2020, but it's an update. That's why we're going to talk about it now. Last week, there's an update that we're going to talk about. So on December 22nd, 2020, this is what you need to know. A train derailed in North Washington, like Washington State, north of Seattle. And the problem is that it was carrying oil, like crude oil, and it caught on fire. It was a big explosion. It was a big deal for this small town where it exploded, the actual place where the train derailed and it exploded, called Custer, Washington. And the reason why we're talking about this story today is because the FBI, Federal Railroad Administration, and the National Transportation Safety Board are all still looking at this derailment and trying to figure out exactly what happened. But there's some new information that came out stating that the only way that this train derailed, the only reason this could possibly happen, is through sabotage. And the reason why it's important to us and to you is because anytime the United States railway system is under attack of any kind or is being threatened in any way, it threatens the entire system. It is impossible to overstate how important the railway system is to the United States and to commerce in this country and internationally even. It is very, very important that we, the United States, the FBI, all of these different, organizations keep the railways safe. Because if something did happen, it could be as simple as one or two people walking across some tracks that are just open, making 2 or 3 small changes on a rail car, and then leaving, and then causing almost $1 million worth of damage and causing massive explosions. Okay, that's a huge run up to this, but let's talk about the details, guys. So this is a BNSF train that was derailed. BNSF has a really interesting history. It's 2 different rail companies that kind of melded into one thing, the Burlington Northern Inc. and I think it's the Santa Fe Pacific Corporation. They went together. They control a ton of the railways in this country, along with just a handful of other large companies that control the railways. And generally, like 99% of the time, at least according to BNSF, there's nothing like this that occurs. Those trains are running all the time, taking things across the country, including crude oil, including most of the stuff you buy on Amazon and eBay and all these other places. They get on rail cars, they go, and everything's fine. Everybody gets what they need. In this case, the rail cars were carrying something very different. We said crude oil, but a specific type of crude oil. It's called Bakken oil. So let's just take a minute and talk about Bakken crude oil, what this stuff is. It's also known as North Dakota Sweet or North Dakota Light, and it's called this because of its low sulfur content, but that also means that it's high in other types of fuels, essentially like butane and some of these other highly flammable substances. So unlike diesel fuel, if that was being carried on one of these trucks, this Bakken oil, when it's inside these pressurized containers, it is essentially a bomb, like legitimately a massive bomb. It's extremely dangerous, and this stuff is being just carted around all the time. And we're not just talking about a little bit. This train that derailed was carrying 3 million gallons of this stuff on 106 different oil tanks, like oil cars, I guess. I don't know what you call them. Containers of oil, like the big ones that you've probably seen before. They're very similar to the ones that refuel your gas station. Okay, so I've kind of jumped around a lot already in this, buried so many leads. Good God, I'm sorry, y'all. Let's talk more about what exactly happened. So you've got a train coming from the North Dakota oil fields.
Ooh, is this a word problem?
I was about to say the same thing.
I know, it is kind of.
What speed?
Well,
what's the velocity?
Here's the crazy thing. The speed limit when it crashed was 10 miles per hour. It was only traveling at 7 miles per hour. Seems like, whoa, how in the heck did that happen? Well, here's where the investigation comes in. And in order to tell you about it, we have to add to the problem, to the math problem.
Okay, great.
Okay. So imagine you are running, you're an engineer on a train, and you've been running through the night. You're on a 12-hour shift. It is around 8:30 in the morning. Your shift is about to end, and you hear that just a little ways further down the rail, there's a delay, so you have to stop for a little bit, for a while.
Okay.
You know you're coming up on time, and the union says you can't go over that 12 hours, so you're going to have to just park that train there for a while. So you have to check, make sure that your 6,500-foot train isn't blocking an intersection somewhere. And once you're clear of that, then you can park your train, you can lock it up, and you can leave. You can take essentially a shuttle back home, or however you get home from there. Just imagine that's you did that. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Noel, you're the next shift guy. You come in,
right.
You're the engineer. You wake up, let's say, and you're like, oh man, I got to get over there. So at 11:15, you arrive via shuttle, and you unlock the train, you get back on, and you get ready to take this train to continue along. By the way, this is perfect. Do you guys know how many human beings it takes to operate a massive mile-long train like this?
I would say 2, 3.
You're correct. Yeah, and literally, yes. An engineer, a conductor, and what they call a brakeman, or a brake person. That is a kind of a weird position that I don't fully understand. In this case, the brake person didn't even get on the train. So one of the 3 people didn't get on the train. They drove all the way over to the refinery, which was just a couple of miles away, or I think 6 or 7 miles away, to make sure that the path is open for this huge rail car as it's coming through. So there are only 2 people, 2 human beings on this train running the whole thing. And as the train departs, you know the coupling? Have you ever seen this as a kid, or maybe played with a toy train, or even been on an actual train and operated it? The coupling between 2 cars, it's fairly unsophisticated, but there are some very sophisticated mechanisms that are also attached between the rail cars. It's not just the connector, but this connector somehow, between the first crew leaving and then Noel showing up, somehow one of these big connectors got released. So as the train pulls away, there's a couple of rail cars on the back that are not fully attached anymore. Mm-hmm. So as the train's getting up to speed, the rail cars behind the fully attached train are getting momentum, and then they detach, and then they're still going. So the problem occurs when the rest of the train stops or has to slow down to make this curve and go 7 miles per hour. The rest of that train speed is continuing along at 21 miles per hour, slams into the back, causes the whole thing to derail. So the big question here, guys, you've seen train tracks around Atlanta. They're all over here because of, Terminus. That's what Atlanta used to be, and it still is in a lot of ways, a giant rail terminal.
Yeah, you're right. Interesting fact about Atlanta. So many cities of that size historically are located at bodies of water for shipping purposes, and it's just easier to keep a clean city. But I would argue that in the case of Atlanta, the rivers or the water in this situation was replaced by rail and then later by air. So they really are kind of the rivers of the city. You can't ship a ton of stuff down the Chattahoochee,
I wonder if you could. That'd be a fun thing to try.
It would be a fun thing to try. One popular pastime here in Atlanta is people have a couple beers, hop on a tube, and then ship themselves down the river.
Yep.
That's about as far as it goes on a day-to-day basis. But
it's a 4-drink minimum for that.
Really?
Where I'm going with this is, it is ridiculously easy in parts of Atlanta to just access a rail car if it stopped. There's a place where my family and I get ice cream that is over here where I live, and it is immediately on the tracks, and you can walk right out to the tracks, and very often there are huge trains of containers with sometimes I don't know how volatile the materials are. I don't know all of the numbers. I know the placards are designed to be identifiable from far away and easily, but the specifics, you have to know like a code a lot of times. But you could just walk right up to them, and if I knew what I was doing, I could detach one of those cars or something and cause this very thing to occur, where it's like a soft detachment. It's not fully detached, but the air brake system is still connected. And there's enough to actually pull the train along, at least for a time, before the other systems break it apart. I think it's just a little scary to me personally, imagining that it's that fragile.
Right.
And while there are a ton of places, like the most important pieces of the infrastructure of the railways are very highly protected, but there's all this open space too, because that's how it functions. You can't have a giant tube, safely covering all of the railways. That's not possible. Mm-hmm. I guess I don't know. That's why I wanted to talk about this today. Sabotaging a train feels like something out of a Western movie.
Oh, 100%.
And something that I wouldn't expect to be happening right now.
Well, one of the big questions, too, is the motivation. So first, this is not the official conclusion, right? If I understand correctly, this is a statement of a rail union official who is definitely an expert, but they are not law enforcement. And I think because of the unique position rail occupies in the U.S., there are multiple agencies that have to finish an inquiry before anybody can officially say this is sabotage or this would be worse for the train companies if they had to say this, or this was an error on our part, because they don't want to be liable for that. There's a lot at stake. But here's the thing. So this becomes an investigation into possible acts of terrorism, right? Just by the nature of trains themselves. But my question to you, Matt, is who would have done this and why? I saw some anecdotal reports about two guys apparently being seen walking away from the train, but I don't think their identities have been released yet.
No, they have not. And that was just a person driving by on the road that runs exactly parallel to the tracks there. And it was seen in that window between the first crew leaving and the second crew arriving. So there is a possibility there that these two guys, maybe one of them knew what they were doing. One of the major things that was said, at least in these conclusions or these alleged conclusions by, what did you say?
The International Association of Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers.
Yes, the like you said, Ben, that union statement, they're saying that whoever did this, if it was sabotage, and they are saying it probably was, somebody knew at least to an extent what they were doing. Mm-hmm. And they won't release full details on that because, again, they don't want to give people a handbook for how to sabotage a train like this. But the other thing to note here, Ben, is that in the past, pretty recently, BNSF and other rail companies have noticed that there have been attempts to sabotage trains, and sometimes successfully, by people putting what they call shunts on the railways to basically confuse the systems on board the trains. So there are people attempting to at least soft sabotage, if you want to call it that, trains. And the other thing to note is that there may be reason to protest some of this material. Like we said, these are high explosives, essentially, that are being carted all over the United States. And we're also talking about fracking here. We're talking about shale oil, essentially, in a lot of these scenarios that's being shipped. So you can imagine some groups that would want to protest anyone profiting from that process that could be causing irreparable damage to the environment and to any individual or animal that needs to drink the water in those areas.
Yeah. And there was a precedent for this too. This spot is nearby where two folks had been arrested just about a month before or so, and they were accused of attempting a literal terrorist attack on the train tracks to disrupt that pipeline plan. So there's some kind of precedent. And of course, we can... Yeah,
that's the shunts we were talking about, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, it really is occurring. And other high-profile recent train derailments have not been about sabotage. They've been more about, at least there have been accusations thrown at some of the companies for not maintaining the rail as well as they should, and others a lot of times pointing blame at the engineer, the operators of the trains. In this case, the train was going at under the speed limit when it derailed. The problem is, though, the engineer and operator, when they switched teams, the way we mentioned they did, they didn't do a brake check. This is a huge thing. The engineer was very early in their career as an engineer. I think it was only a month or a couple of months being an official engineer. And they failed to run a brake check before they started up the train and started going down the tracks. And it's an air brake system. It's complicated. We could talk about that more later. But again, that's not stuff they don't want you to know. What they don't want you to know is that no matter what the motivations, even if they're noble in a lot of ways, no matter what the motivations for wanting to disrupt the system in this kind of way, there would be such a disruption to everything if it were to happen frequently or at scale. So I would just say, I don't know, protect those rails. There is something you can dig into if you want to. I don't know exactly how you would categorize it, but there's a group that is, you can go to railsecurity.org. There's a group of people. I don't know if these are lobbyists. I don't know what exactly this is. It's the Rail Security Alliance. You can see all of these different bills that are being put forward, all this reporting that's happening relating to this group, and what they want. But essentially they want to just protect the rail systems. Okay. And no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, I think that's probably a good idea.
Yeah, I think everybody can agree they like getting stuff, right? And you need to have a rail system. There's a lot more that the U.S. could do with its rail system as well. But, it always brings me back to the conversation we have about alternative transport in general. Like, if people were better behaved, we could use dirigibles much more often. And the problem with rail is that it is also vulnerable in very unique ways to bad actors, because it's not as if you can suddenly turn left in a train. You can't know something is on the horizon and take an alternate route. You go from point A to point B with no real chance of agility, right? or maneuvering. So it's easy to predict where a train will be. And that's part of why so much work goes into keeping them secure. There is not an alternative at this point to ship things the way that we can with trains. That's why there are so many regulatory bodies that are super interested in anything going wrong on a train. That's why the staff or the employees are unionized. Their jobs are incredibly important to the vitality of the U.S.
That's right. That is right.
And it's interesting that it's such a legacy, technology. They haven't really figured out how to improve upon. You know what I mean? Like, all that infrastructure still remains, and it's still absolutely kind of the beating heart of moving all of these products around. Obviously, there's also ships and shipping containers and planes and freight, planes, but rail really is the most efficient one, and you can set your watch by it, right? Because you're not really subject to the same kinds of traffic issues that you would be, with freight, with Teamsters and all that.
Yeah. And there's a huge political push in the United States right now for this, whatever the legislation finalizes as for this infrastructure bill coming through. And I'd be interested to know, I haven't looked at the nuts and bolts of it, but I'm wondering if there is money being spent on the rail system. I don't know. God, am I just being an old curmudgeon now? Like, watch out for the trains. We've got to protect the trains. All the crude oil.
You should watch out for trains, though. It's like, not for nothing. Once those things get going, they don't stop. That's why brakeman is a job.
Have you seen fried green tomatoes? I mean, heartbreaking what can happen with those trains.
I've been watching Handmaid's Tale. I've been watching this latest season. I know what happens.
So
and it all happens in slow motion for some reason.
People don't tie damsels. Villains aren't as easy to spot anymore because they don't tie damsels in distress to train tracks as much as they used to.
Right.
They don't have curly mustaches either, which is a shame.
But yeah, shout out to everybody. If you're listening to this while you're operating a train, good on you. Just be careful.
Have some coffee. Stay awake. Stay on your toes. This is going to conclude our strange news for the week, but never fear, we will return with more. And in the meantime, we would love to hear from you, whether you have proof that there is indeed fruit on Mars, and New York Times got shut down by Big Space Melon, whether you have lived in El Salvador, or whether you're just a Bitcoin enthusiast. We'd love to hear your take on their new policy, whether or not it could be a conspiracy. And if you are, as Matt said, working in the rail industry, or if you are just hopping on some freight, we'd like to hear from you. We'd especially like to hear about the motivation for any possible sabotage. We try to make it easy to find us online.
That's right. You can find us in the usual internet locations of note. We are on Facebook, where we are Conspiracy Stuff. We're Conspiracy Stuff Show on Twitter. You can also find us on the telephone. That's a thing people still use. We are 1-833-STDWYTK.
Yes, please leave us your name, or at least the name you'd like for us to refer to you as. We can call you anything you want. Doesn't matter. Or you can just be anonymous. It's fine. Once you get started, that time is yours. You've got 3 minutes. Use it however you wish. We recommend that you say anything you think should be on air at the top, and then anything you want to say to us personally, just say that at the end of your message. And if you've got way too much to say, we ask that you don't call multiple times for the same message. If you got a lot to say, just please send us a good old-fashioned email. We are
conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.